This is a little video about my baby, the Warrior Brewing Pilot Brewery, which is a heat exchange recirculating mash system. The system uses 3 converted Sankey kegs as kettles. Each keg is a half barrel, which is 15.5 US gallons or about 58 litres. There's a hot liquor tank, which is the hot water source for the lautering process. Lautering usually consists of mash out, recirculation and then sparging, but with this system the recirculation takes place during the mashing process. Then there's a malt liquor tank, also known as a mash tun, in which the crushed grains are steeped to extract the malt, which is the food source for the yeast that converts the sugars to alcohol. The mash tun has a screened false bottom to provide a space below the grains to allow the malt to be drawn off. Next is the boil kettle. The boil process performs a number of complex functions critical to making beer. This is where the hops are added at various stages during the boil to add flavour and bitterness to offset the sweetness of the malt. All kinds of alchemy takes place during the boil. The boil kettle also has a screen at the bottom to prevent as much of the hop sludge, hot break and other particulate matter from being pumped out of the kettle at the end of the boil process. The system is controlled by a BCS 460 brewery control system from Embedded Control Concepts. It's housed in an enclosure along with solid-state relays and other electrical wiring. The interface to the controller is via Ethernet to a computer browser. I've set up a wireless connection to it, and it has an iPhone app allowing processes and parameters to be adjusted on the phone as well as on a computer. Each kettle has a temperature probe connected to the control system. Each kettle is heated by a high-pressure propane burner. The MLT and HLT burners have solenoid valves in addition to regulating valves to enable them to be controlled automatically by the BCS controller. I can set the mash strike temperature and sparge water temperatures and not have to worry about keeping my eye on them so they don't boil like I do so many times without automation. I connect up a water supply for the system that goes through an activated charcoal filter to get rid of chlorine and other things I'd prefer not to have in my beer that might appear in city tap water. During the mashing process, malt liquor is taken from the mash tun and recirculated through a heat exchange system and back into the mash kettle. The heat exchanger uses hot water surrounding a stainless steel coil through which the malt liquor circulates, so that no direct heat is applied to the malt, which prevents scorching of the malt. The water is heated by an electric water heater element, and a small submersible pump circulates the heating water to make sure there is optimum heat transfer. The temperature probe for the heat exchanger is immediately after the coil, so the PID controller can properly control the recirculating malt temperature. The lines are all lagged to prevent heat loss during the recirculation process. Recirculating during the mashing process allows the grain bed to develop, and the filtering process done by the grain bed creates a lovely clear malt. The heat exchanger is needed to accurately maintain the mashing temperature. The heat exchanger also allows me to perform step mashes without having to add water or apply direct heat to the mash tun. So, to start the brewing process, first start filling the HLT. I then fire up the HLT burner to slowly bring it up to mash out temperature. My brew software calculates the volume of water needed for the weight of grain. So I start to fill the MLT to the required volume by putting the 3-way valve on the mash kettle in the mash position and open the MLT fill valve. I also set the mash temperature for the burner control and also the hex. By using an L-type 3-way valve, I can control the mash and sparge operations with a single valve. Off is off. Then to mash, it's fully open in the mash position. To sparge, it's possible to isolate the mash and sparge pipework and just crack the valve in the sparge position to drain the mash tun very slowly while sparging. Now we have the MLT coming up to temperature. I also open the recirc control valve and start the mash pump. When the HLT is full, I shut off the fill valve and let it come up to temperature. When the water in the mash tun has reached strike temperature, it's time to dough in by adding in the grain. The important temperature in the mash process is the temperature inside the mash tun. The recirculating temperature is used to regulate that. The recirculating liquid is introduced via a hose that gently flows onto the top of the grain to avoid splashing and aeration. No hot side aeration allowed. At the end of the mashing period, to begin the mash out process, set the three-way valve to the off position and open up the HLT valve. This will flush malt from the recirc line and add the prescribed amount of hot water to the mash. Pause the recirc system and shut the HLT valve for the mash out period, which is about 10 minutes. To begin the sparge, crack the three-way valve in the sparge position to begin very slowly draining the mash tun. At the same time, open the HLT valve and start the recirc system again. During the sparge, I adjust the three-way valve and the recirc valve so that the run out of the malt to the boil kettle matches the rate of sparge water being added to the mash tun. This maintains a water level over the grains for as long as possible. Once the boil kettle starts to fill with a reasonable volume, I start the burner to begin heating the malt to the boil. A calibrated dip rod allows me to know when the correct amount of sparge water has been added, at which time I shut off the mash pump, recirc and HLT valve and just let the malt continue to drain slowly. When that's complete, I shut off the three-way mash valve and disconnect the boil kettle filler tube and then begin bringing it to the boil. Because I make 45 litre batches, when you allow for boil off and other losses, the pre-boil volume is about 54 litres, so the boil kettle is pretty full. So when you first bring it to the boil, you have to watch out for boil over. As the wort comes to the boil, a lot of foam is generated by proteins that coagulate due to the rolling action of the boil, and that foaming action is initially very vigorous. I have to be really careful with temperature control at that time and scoop off all that goop. The proteins continue to form until the protein clumps get heavy enough to sink back into the pot, and you see strands of goop floating around the wort. The point at which the foaming stops is called the hot break, and is also what the floating goop is called. Some people mistakenly call the instant that the vigorous foaming begins the hot break, but I call that the hell break, because that's what breaks loose if you're not careful. A boil over on my rig is messy enough, but for home brewers doing it in their kitchens, 15 minutes before the end of the boil, I put the immersion chiller in the boiling wort to sterilize it. Upon flame out, I cover it with a special lid that has a stirrer motor and stirrer arm built onto it. Sanitized, of course. The motor is a windscreen wiper motor and keeps the hot wort moving past the cooling coil. If there's no movement, only the wort in immediate contact with the coil is cooled. The stirring action is gentle enough that it doesn't splash the wort or cause any hot side aeration. I connect up a Y hose to the immersion chiller inlet. One connection is for the garden hose, which provides the initial cooling from boiling down to about 40 to 50 C. The second connection has a valve that connects a line to a freezer full of water. It's a 5 cubic foot freezer, so it has about 140 litres of near frozen water in it. The secondary cooling water source is needed, particularly in the summer where the groundwater temperature is over 26 C. There's no way cooling water at that temperature will get the wort down to a pitching temperature of about 16 C. But the secondary source sure does, and I actually have to watch it carefully so I don't cool the wort too much. My immersion chiller is somewhat of an uber chiller anyway. To get a decent cold break and prevent reformation of dimethyl sulfide, otherwise known as DMS, they tell you that you need to cool your wort from boiling to under 50 C in about 20 minutes. I do it in 4. That's why I prefer an immersion chiller over a counterflow chiller, because while the CFC chills the passing wort faster, my entire wort is cooled in a lot less time, and my cold break stays in the boil kettle and doesn't end up in the fermenter, thanks to my filters. Once I'm at pitching temperature, I let it all just sit and settle for a while. All the lines to transfer the wort to the fermenter are pre-sanitized, so all I have to do is connect them up. The head on the wort pump comes off easily, so I sanitize that along with all the lines. I have a 2-stage trube filtering system, so hop trube as well as hot and cold break proteins are minimized in the transfer to the fermenter. There's a trube screen at the bottom of the boil kettle to act as a primary screen, and then I have an inline 0.5mm filter to get the rest. Without the primary filter though, too much goop clogs up the inline filter. transfer the wort to the fermenter, it's just a matter of opening the boil kettle outlet valve and start the wort pump. The result is a nice clean wort minus the hop tube, hot break, cold break and other undesirable particulate matter. Now we're ready to pitch the yeast and begin fermentation. I create a yeast starter to generate sufficient yeast cells needed for fermentation, and that's been sitting roiling away on a starter plate. Since I've gone over the top with everything else, of course I did the same for oxygenation. I have a special flow meter to regulate a precise amount of oxygen from the O2 bottle for my welding and cutting torch. But even this is a work in progress. At this time, my dissipation stone is on a flexible plastic hose that I have to sanitize and dangle down in the wort. What I want to do is have the stone mounted on a stainless shaft with a tri-clamp fitting to connect it to one of the fermenter lid fittings. This will hold it more rigidly in place at a precise depth in the fermenter and be easier to attach and sanitize. And the final step is fermentation, for which temperature control is a critical factor. The top brewers maintain that you have to get the fermentation process right, or pretty much everything else you do is a waste of time. My fermentation fridge is controlled by another BCS controller, which enables me to either locally or remotely monitor and control the fermentation temperature, whether that's from home, work, or even on my iPhone while I enjoy a pint somewhere. I've tried really hard to make sure each step is utterly controllable and repeatable, but I'm sure I'll be tweaking some part of it for quite some time to come.